Well, thanks to everyone for coming. It's great to be here. So today I'm going to talk about 3 different studies, so about 4 minutes each. So it'll be brief. I won't go too into depth, but I'll ask for opportunities to get your questions and feedback after each of the 3 brief studies. One is currently in data collection. The second one is actually published. It's a book chapter, and you'll see what I mean, that it's very relevant to today in history. And then the third one is a paper that has just been analyzed, and we'll be sending it out for review soon. So just a brief recap on kind of who I am as a researcher. I look at mindfulness in relation to how folks at work show up and interact with each other. Specifically, my research stream is committed to understanding leadership and what makes leaders more effective in working with followers. So I really mesh mindfulness with leadership and look at a lot of the explanatory mechanisms of how emotions unfold in the workplace. So the first study I want to briefly talk about today is a study around leader mindfulness and how that impacts outcomes at the follower level. So think about a leader at work has 4 or 5 or 10 subordinates that work for him or her. How does he or she show up at work? How does the emotional space that they create then impact followers' levels of engagement, job satisfaction, motivation, and well-being? So looking at multiple levels of mindfulness in the workplace. So some select hypotheses here. Really, leaders show up at work and tend to be more or less mindful throughout the day, right? Does that impact their ability to regulate the emotions, downregulate the negative emotions, and perhaps, upregulate the negative emotions and downregulate the positive emotions to be even keeled, such that you're not sort of stressing people out and kind of this roller coaster of emotions as their leader? And then how does that then impact or interact, rather, this leader's level of mindfulness with how the followers show up at work with their levels of mindfulness in predicting how engaged followers ultimately are at work? So here, just with the hypotheses that I mentioned in that last slide, sort of what the model would look like. Here we have leader mindfulness leading to leaders demonstrating more empathy and the ability to be more in control of the emotions they demonstrate to folks at work, leading to their sense of well-being at the leader level. And that also impacts the follower level. So multiple followers nested within the structure of their leaders are more engaged because of that leader. That's the idea, which ultimately leads them to demonstrate emotions at work, such as increased job satisfaction, higher levels of motivation, and they demonstrate more well-being as well. So this is just beginning to get kicked off as far as the data collection. Around 90 leaders in a tech firm, or tech industry rather, around 4 followers per leader. 3 points in time. So if you go back to this model, sort of the independent variables are collected at one point in time, the mediators at a second point in time, and your dependent variables at a third point in time. Just started at the beginning of November. Getting ahead of myself here. So in general, it's the biggest challenge I have as a researcher is getting access to the kind of the corporate leaders. They always want the data. They're always excited about leadership and mindfulness, but then when they realize that they have to give 15 minutes of their time and of their subordinates' time to take surveys, they often say, "Oh, no, thanks. We'll let other people contribute to the research, and we'll just capitalize on it later." So in this case, we have a site that is engaged and is ready and shows all signs of being committed throughout the 3-month period. Yeah, because some folks, you have to be very careful how you talk about mindfulness because folks, and if they're not sure exactly what it is, perhaps they're a little unwilling to explore something that's relatively newer in the business domain. Okay, so this one, I was putting the slides together, and then I remembered today when I was watching the news that it was 1 year ago today that we had the results of our presidential election. So it's interesting that I'm presenting today. It must have been meant to be. But I contributed to a book in a chapter, as the final chapter, and the book was entitled Why Irrational Politics Appeals, Understanding the Allure of Trump. And the idea really was that this book kind of was published at the time of the election to help folks put together of where are we, how did we get here, how do we put together the pieces of whatever the election was. We didn't know at that time what the election would be, but how did this even happen? So that was sort of the idea of the book, and it was a popular press sort of book, but it was contributed to by mostly academics. But the idea was that it's a little bit more readable than some of the work that academics put out. So this idea that I talk about in the chapter is really twofold. Self-preservation is being activated, and we want to outcompete. And the Western world, on average, tends to say it's about out-competing other folks. Perhaps it is derived from our Darwin survival of the fittest. And so I talk and introduce these two ideas, drawing upon Dr. Brown's work, among others, around this idea of the human ego is very much activated. And when that happens, it's really about fight or flight. And so we have this engaged amygdala and suppressed prefrontal cortex that's happening on the physiological side when we're scared, when we're nervous, when we worry about what's happening to us or our in-group is shrinking. And then on the psychological side, we have this reinforcement of this human ego where we take things personally. So this creates sort of threefold here, this us versus them mentality that I think we saw play out in the primaries and in the presidential election. I make this kind of link to what we talk about in the business literature of distributive versus integrative negotiation. If you think about negotiating, it's all about me wanting something and you wanting something, and we're going to negotiate back and forth to see how much of the value you claim versus how much I claim. There's sort of two models in which we look at. Question? Oh, 5 minutes. Yes, thank you. Distributive versus integrative negotiation. Integrative is expanding the pie, taking a bigger pie. How is it win-win? And then we can divvy up the pie so that each of us gets a bigger piece than we otherwise would. That's win-win integrative negotiation. On the other side, we have distributive negotiation. Fixed pie, you get some, I get some. Whatever you get, I don't get, because it's inherently win-lose, right? So that was something that was going on. And the interesting thing here, and what I argued in the chapter, is on the sphere of national and world politics, it's not about winning now. And that was the rhetoric, is win now. Win now claims all the value. And just like my students, when I teach negotiations, learn that when someone really messes someone up over a negotiation and we talk about it as a class, that has implications for the next negotiation. People don't give you the benefit of the doubt. They don't trust you. And on a world stage, that can be really problematic. So that's one of the arguments I made. And then, of course, we feel this sort of us versus them, and we feel that things are, that we're getting nervous and there's negative things happening, so we share that, right? We have the neuroscience research to back it up, this idea of emotional contagion, of mirror neurons. We know that this happens, so this negative kind of fear-based thinking then spreads to other people. So those are the three factors that I talk about of sort of how we got where we got there. Of course, I with pun intended, say mindfulness as the trump card. Really, how does mindfulness help us work through this, where we're at now, where we're going when we're in the middle of the election season? How do we turn on the news and not become so numb that we just turn it back on again? I didn't take my advice very well, because I was just remarking to my partner this morning, I think we just started watching TV again like a month ago, because it had been difficult to see everything every day. But at least in theory, mindfulness helps us suppress the fight or flight response, quieting that voice in the head, helping us bring about more well-being and understand the picture goes a little bit beyond ourselves. So that was a fun chapter to contribute to. It's out. Interesting book. I kind of had an interesting opportunity to contribute to it, so I took it. So just wanted to present that a bit given today. Okay, so a work that just now in the data analysis stage really gets this idea of, we look at mindfulness often as the predictor. What does mindfulness lead to as far as a set of processes? What do those processes then lead to as a set of outcomes or dependent variables? Well, research also shows that mindfulness is highly variable. But what's predicting why people show up one day versus the next, either more or less mindfully? So the idea in this study is, hey, what is the antecedent, the predictor of how you show up day to day regarding your mindfulness? So we look at person-specific factors and situation-specific factors. I'll concentrate on the bottom set of situation-specific factors today, this idea of your skill-challenge balance. So what's happening? So we ping students at 3 points in time a day, said, what were you doing right now? What's your level of mindfulness? Between the last survey and this survey, what was happening? How did you feel that your tasks met your current ability to meet the challenge? So if you're familiar with the flow literature, that's the idea. You're perfectly in tune when you have the right knowledge set right now to meet the challenge ahead of you. It's this skill challenge balance. What hindrances perhaps were you experiencing that got in the way of completing tasks? And then a specifically very interesting one was your technology use, passive as well as active. 3 surveys, 9:30, 2:30, 7:30 p.m. for 7 consecutive days. Over 30,000 responses made up of Science of Happiness, the Flourishing class, as well as the LEAD residence dorms and business students contributed to this study. Results: active technology does not affect levels of mindfulness, right? So when people are intentionally engaging with technology for Wikipedia, for thinking through, getting more knowledge about class, for example, helpful. As we may suggest, or as we may think, passive use of technology is really detrimental to, does affect. Yes, it's the one that's the most detrimental to levels of mindfulness. Positive social interactions increase mindfulness, and then the extent to which you have a good skill challenge balance also increased your level of mindfulness.